is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menton, recording today on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined today by my two co-hosts. Global Vice President for Marketing and Extortion at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. Thrilled to be with you from Gadigal land and have been exercising my responsibilities for marketing and extortion at the LMSU podcast. But more on that another time. I'll just leave that hanging there juicily.
Or somewhat ominously.
To be determined later in the show.
Listeners don't have to be scared of me. Yet.
All right. And the only talking head I'm aware of that has publicly blamed Victoria's recent power outages on a kaiju attack, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Look, somebody had to be the one to bell the cat or the Godzilla, as the case may be. I'm the one brave enough to say what others won't.
Speaking truth to power yet again. Tennant, well done.
Power lines.
On this week's show, we dig into the wonky detail of the Albanese government's proposed vehicle fuel efficiency standard. But first, last week, the National Press Club hosted a Deadpool/Wolverine level team up for economics tragics as Hawke government alums Ross Garno and Rod Sims joined forces to argue for a range of reforms that they say would supercharge Australia's effort to become a clean energy superpower. Tennant, there was a bunch of interesting ideas thrown out there, some of which the major parties have been studiously avoiding for some time. What did you make of this address?
Well, look, first I think I have to say that given their respective ages, this was more of a Magneto and Professor X team up.
I was about to ask which one is Deadpool.
I think we'll leave that to the imaginations of our listeners.
So the Ross and Rod Superpower Spectacular was an opportunity to shake up the debate a bit with some new ideas and maybe some old ideas in new clothing. They are very much trying to put policy on the map, directions on the map that are consistent with the task they think we should set ourselves of decarbonising not just the roughly 1% of global emissions that Australia directly contributes within its borders, but decarbonising somewhere between 7 and 9% of the world economy through not just replacing or ending high emissions exports of fossil fuels in the long term, but replacing them with exports of green metals that can be produced here much more competitively in the long term than in a lot of other places. And they have a bunch of ideas about how to do that. But the big one is the Climate Solutions Levy, Carbon Solutions Levy, which is a honking big carbon tax on the carbon content of fuels produced in or imported to Australia, including those fuels produced here and then combusted overseas. The ultimate combustion emissions would be pre-taxed here. And that would produce a lot of revenue, particularly if it's pegged at the level of the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme carbon price, starting in the region of 100 Australian dollars a tonne. They reckon that would produce by 2030, which is when they really think this needs to be in by, about $100 billion a year of revenue. And that revenue would be allocated to a lot of good things that they want to do, including backing the capacity investment scheme so that it doesn't wreck the federal budget. They want to fund the Commonwealth building transmission and transmission for electricity for the mega ultra electricity infrastructure that would be needed for this enormous expansion in hydrogen production to service the steel sector. And they want to also do the same thing for hydrogen pipelines, build them ahead of demand. And they want to have a big grants and assistance scheme, the Superpower Innovation Investment Scheme, that would pump money into the first few examples of mega clean industry projects, whether that be green iron production facilities or clean alumina plants or whatever. They'll need big subsidies to start, and those subsidies would ultimately be carried. The dawn industries, the sunrise industries, would be subsidised into existence by the fading, yet still profitable for a while, sunset industries. And, there was more in there. They like the NEM. They want to keep the NEM. They don't want to do a lot of violence to the NEM. But, that's probably enough to be going on with. And they said a bunch of people would hate it. And they said that their new Superpower Institute will turn people's minds around over the next few years.
They did. I thought one of the most interesting things about this address was that it crystallised a very particular vision of the superpower, because there's a few different visions of superpowerdom, right? There's the idea that we're producing all this hydrogen and shipping it around the world. Interestingly, this was explicitly not that.
Yes.
They canvassed an argument that we've covered a number of times on the pod over the last couple of years, which is just, how expensive and technically challenging it is to ship hydrogen around the world. The challenges are such that they say, and this is certainly borne out by a lot of the reports we've looked at, in many cases it's going to make a lot more sense to do the value add and use the hydrogen here in Australia and then ship the goods overseas. And interestingly, they were saying, well, this isn't just us, we're very dry economists and we think things should be made wherever it is most cost effective to make them, where there's a genuine competitive advantage. But because of the particular characteristics of Australia and the fuels that were likely to be available, vast renewable resources, etc., like in this new reality, we do have a competitive advantage and we are going to be able to make many of these products at a much lower cost relative to other parts of the world. So hop in. So it's interesting, and, given that there's plenty of state governments running around sort of saying they're going to be exporting hydrogen here, there and everywhere, I think it'll be really interesting to see the nuances of that debate about if we are going to go for a superpower vision, what specific superpower vision we go for, because that has huge implications for the type of infrastructure we build, the kind of partnerships we build with some of our trading partners. And it's really important to be clear about what we're actually trying to do if we're about to invest billions and billions of dollars into very big infrastructure projects.
I mean, they had pretty particular ideas that, iron ore is very much at the top of that list. Yeah. I think aluminium, they also said, would be big. I don't know if they listed out more. I mean, to my reading of this, it is that, incredibly optimistic and laudable vision that we should be seeking to capitalise on all the natural assets that we have here. They also highlighted that we're a country that has, access to relatively low capital costs as well. Cost of finance to get projects up and running. They didn't talk about cost of labour and things like that, but I guess they're highlighting this potential future, which we all know will cost a mozza to get, the kind of infrastructure up to support it, right? So it felt like the proposal around the levy, was sort of set up to then say, well, we've got this amazing vision, and we've read, loads of other reports on this pod that suggest that the task of going, that extra mile beyond meeting the needs of, energy in Australia versus becoming a superpower, an exporter of green steel, et cetera, is a stonkingly big investment, in all the technology needed to make that happen. So, this feels like, well, here's the solution for that. We need to put in a levy.
And I can't believe I didn't mention this up front. They put a lot of stress on not just the need for the levy, but the need for incorporating the carbon externality into the pricing of goods.
I can't believe you forgot to talk about CBAM in this, Tenant.
Indeed, because they didn't forget. They put a lot of emphasis on the European Union, and they predicted increasingly others moving to incorporate carbon prices into goods prices so that clean products would be more profitable, more competitive than dirty ones. And an Australian CBAM is a part of their carbon border adjustment mechanism, is a part of their proposal as well. And that is important because in the absence of a signal like that, green steel is going to be, or, you know, in the absence of that or honking big subsidies forever, green steel is going to be more expensive to end users than conventional steel. So the markets that we propose to export all this stuff to have got to be on board, or we will be maybe competitive against other people making green steel, but there won't be any of them or any of us doing it because it won't be able to earn its keep against conventional steel.
Yeah, the European CBAM was like the cornerstone of the argument in a lot of ways, and in the Q&A they kept returning back to it as a extant example of the type of thing they're talking about around, you know, regulations that can be introduced around the world to preference lower carbon intensity goods in the market and give them the leg up they need to actually get across the price barrier. And there was an implicit assumption that, you know, other countries would follow suit. And while there's a lot of interest in CBAM, we are a long way, I think, from CBAM sweeping the world. And so there's a little bit of...
Oh, well, oh, ye of little faith.
Well, I don't know. You know, the EU is leading with their chin. And my impression is, notwithstanding, you know, Australia is exploring this option, various other countries are, you know, kicking the tyres. I think there's going to be most countries around the world will be observing with interest what the experience of the European CBAM is. If it's regarded as a success, you know, we could well see more CBAMs rolled out. But if not, you know, like we could be a way away from the type of external demand for these types of goods that Ross and Rod are projecting. But maybe that's okay, because all the things they're talking about will take a long time to ramp up anyway, right? So this is a 10, 15, 20, 30-year vision that they're laying out, and perhaps one can assume that there will be something, like we've almost got to assume there's going to be something that's going to be creating demand for these sorts of products, right? Otherwise we're all cooked.
So then what do you both make of like another selling point made in this speech early on was around the other uses that some of that money could be put to in terms of relieving cost of living pressures on people. I mean, that's a very immediate
bit of topical red meat there, Frankie.
Well, yeah, but you kind of, I mean, you know, you can't ignore it because they've pitched it out there as something that, you know, they see as being able to assist with, I guess, two major areas they pointed out: fuel costs and electricity or energy costs that are currently, you know, adding to inflation. So I thought that was interesting that they put that out there, considering the point that you just made, Luke. Notwithstanding their very valid comments about the need for us to be thinking more structurally around the budget and the, you know, sources of revenue that we're currently getting from resources that are going to be shriveling up over time.
Yeah, and some version of this has been part of Garneau's thinking for the last several years, a honking big tax on fossil exports in order to do a bunch of good stuff. There are some obvious complications with that. And like besides the most obvious one, which is that $100 billion will always be missed, There is, some very, very boring folderol that could be said about investment climate, and if you're trying to attract mega investment in a new resources-y and manufacturing-y sector, is mugging the old one the greatest way to appeal to those new investors. As unpopular as the old industries are with a lot of people, I don't know. It's a tricky one, and that is the thing that has probably been the most, apart from just the out and out explicit, hey, high carbon taxes are great, political trigger warning. I think the getting into a massive fight with a significant chunk of the resources sector bit is also not at the top of the I would love this to be my next 5 years list for any member of the current federal government.
So, as I understand it, Rod Sims is the chair of this new body called the Superpower Institute. Ross Garnaut is the deputy chair. Apparently, they have been in operation since sometime last year, but this is effectively them coming out of stealth mode and putting themselves on the map.
And how?
They sure have. And, the task that they've set themselves is to, prosecute this case. They recognised that this was unlikely to be adopted by any of the major political parties anytime soon, although it was noted in the course of the Q&A that followed the address that the Greens had signed up during the press club address.
I love that. So, real time.
Good to build a bit of early momentum, I suppose.
And there were a bunch of teals in that room too, and some of them were taking selfies afterwards with the good professors.
So, but their point is, look, they recognise that, the whole idea of a carbon price is pretty toxic in Australia, but they're taking it upon themselves to, embark upon the task of detoxifying it and kind of explaining why this is ultimately in Australia's best interests, which I think is, a welcome role for an institution to play, because everyone on this podcast would not expect a carbon price to achieve all the things we need to achieve. Price on carbon certainly won't hurt on the way through, right? So having that debate or reopening that debate, prying open the Overton window, doesn't seem like that bad an idea.
It's hard to get away from them. That's true of carbon prices and of Ross and Rod.
Absolutely. I'd be taking selfies with them in any room I found myself in where they were.
All right. Well, Ross, Rod, you're on notice.
Yep.
Askavich selfies incoming. Shall we chat about a report?
We should.
I think we better.
Fuel efficiency standards set an average carbon intensity target for vehicles sold by each supplier in a given country and apply a penalty to the supplier if the target isn't met. These standards are commonplace around the world, and for good reason. They lower the emissions associated with driving, cut fuel bills for consumers, and have the happy side effect of encouraging suppliers to introduce more electric vehicles into their product offering. Yet despite all the upsides, Australia has spent the last 15 years almost, but not quite, introducing such a standard, leaving us in the naughty corner with Russia as one of the only 2 developed nations in the world that have failed to implement this no-brainer regulation. But the indomitable, if sometimes indolent, Australian spirit may yet prevail. Back in 2022, the Albanese government committed to introduce a fuel efficiency standard, and this month saw the release of the consultation impact analysis. It includes 3 design options, including the government's preferred model. Frankie, this is a long overdue reform, but there is a lot of detail to get across here. What did you make of this paper?
Well, there's loads to unpack in this paper. I mean, you could say it's laden with 15 years worth of policy emotional baggage that we're dredging up. I think in the reading for this pod, I stumbled across reference to John Howard's commissioning of the Australian Transport Council and the Environment Protection and Heritage Council in 2007 for measures, that would move us towards international best practice, which included sales-weighted average CO2 standards for cars, either legislated or voluntary. So there's like a lot of probably collective trauma around the place from the lack of implementation of any such standard. So let's just acknowledge that this has been looked at quite a few times by successive governments over the last little while. And we're finally here on the brink of a real prospect of having a standard put in place. I think it's worth stating at the outset why it's important. Transport emissions are a really big chunk of Australia's emissions. They're over, I think, about 20%. That's dominated by cars, and that I think they account for over 60% of total transport emissions. So we're talking the major chunk in passenger vehicles, the cars that you and I would drive around in, and then a smaller but significant also percentage in light commercial vehicles, so your vans and utes. And if we weren't going to do anything about this, transport was on track to be the second largest source of emissions in the country by 2030. Emissions from transport and cars particularly has increased over time. They haven't been decreasing just by nature of BAU technology improvements. They've increased because the number of cars have increased significantly in this country far faster than any improvements in efficiency have sort of made. And it's sort of evident when you look around. We've gotten to like bigger cars too in this country, a lot more SUVs going around than there used to be. So we need to do something about this. It's not tenable to have a net zero by 2050 target and not target the transport sector, and specifically the biggest chunk of that being cars. So what does the standard do? Well, there's a lot of detail under this, but in simple terms, the major features are, actually pretty simple to think about. We would be setting a limit on, the CO2 emissions for new cars across a fleet from a supplier. So on average, the weighted, the average of cars any supplier would be bringing into the country needs to meet that particular standard. If any car is beating that standard, is performing better, you get a credit for that. If it's doing worse, you get a debit. And, over the certain compliance period, you're going to have your credits and debits summed up, and, every supplier would have a net position, and that needs to be acquitted at some point. The standards are obviously, they're not just figures. We have curves, so we're not applying the same standard for, every car that's out there on the road. We've got two curves that we're looking at. So there's one curve that's being defined for passenger vehicles and another one for light utility vehicles, so the vans and utes. And significantly, passenger vehicles is not just including small, sedans and things like that. It's also including SUVs and most four-wheel drives, which are very prevalent on roads. This isn't based on forbidding the sale of any particular car. It's all about trying to maximise the mix of cars that any given supplier brings in such that they meet the standard. So how do you do that? Over time, as those curves get more ambitious and the requirements, sort of increase commensurately, well, you're probably going to have to introduce more electric vehicles or cars with lower emissions to then meet that overall standard.
So importantly, this won't ban stretch Hummers.
It will not.
That's still totally appropriate. But if there were too many stretch Hummers in the cars that a particular supplier was bringing in, they would run the risk of exceeding that threshold for average emissions intensity and would potentially be on the hook for a penalty, right?
Yes. If you were a purveyor of only stretch Hummers into this country, you'd probably be sweating in your luxury.
Into your cowboy boots, I think.
I think so. I'm pretty sure there'd be disco balls in there too. So, I mean, look, maybe you'd be having fun while you're sweating in your cowboy boots there. But the point is, you'd be wanting to hope you've got a more diversified offering into the market, because you're either going to need to have to pay the fee associated with the debits, or you need to be able to net those out with credits from lower emissions vehicles. And over time, because the standard would be tightening, that's going to necessitate more EVs being part of that mix to bring your overall average down.
So, Frankie, what you're saying is that if my business can diversify into 50% stretch Hummers and 50% electric Popemobiles, then I've got a viable proposition here, at least with the government regulator, maybe not with customers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm intrigued by that proposition, Tennant. I feel like it merits a dodgy spreadsheet moment from you.
Oh, I will get spreadsheeting the Popemobiles immediately. I need to get some stats on the weight of a Popemobile and how much extra weight when it goes electric.
Yeah, a sidebar on whether the stretch Hummer would fall into the light utility vehicle category because of the weight. But anyway.
And they're not making them anymore. Not new. There's no new Hummers. Anyway, we digress.
My apologies. I derailed us.
But I mean, look, maybe we can pause there and have a chat, because I do think it's probably worth talking about why the government's looking at two different curves for passenger vehicles versus light utility vehicles. Some of that is an artefact, I think, or certainly seeking to learn from the experience in other countries as well, who have had these standards for a very long time.
Everyone else is doing it. Why shouldn't we?
Exactly. So we also, I guess, have the benefit of being able to, if not leapfrog, at least learn from the mistakes of other jurisdictions and try not to make some of those mistakes up front.
Yeah. I mean, if you have a single, all vehicles on a single curve, I mean, what the curve is plotting is weight versus allowable emissions. Heavier vehicles will tend to have more emissions if they're of the same drive technology. And should all vehicles be on the same curve? Well, there's an argument that some vehicles just need to be heavier because of the nature of the task that they've got. And a van for transporting a bunch of people or a bunch of equipment, or a ute that is used as a ute and not as an expression of the soul of its driver, that's actually used for you carrying heavy, awkward things, has got to be reinforced to a certain degree and just has different requirements on it than, I don't know, a sports car or a boring but practical hatchback, or whatever. And so if you put them all on the one curve, in principle, all larger vehicle drivers could wind up subsidising all smaller vehicle drivers. And is that something that ought to happen? Some people would say yes, and some people would say no, and some people would like to run a mile from that whole discussion, because it's probably not really what this all needs to be about. The sort of smaller cars are the solution, part of the solution maybe, but fundamentally you've just got to move everything to a zero emissions energy source, however much energy they're using. And well, my interpretation of this, of the government's preferred option, option B, the Goldilocks option in the selection they present, is that it would be largely met by more EVs getting sold, there'd be a bit of encouragement for smaller vehicles, but it's just mostly electric.
Smaller vehicles, or the adoption of technology that has improved fuel efficiency, that's had take up in other countries. So like, if you think about things that can be done to make vehicles more efficient, you get into things like aerodynamics or increasing gear ratios to ensure that you're not...
Regenerative braking.
Yeah. All of those things, are innovations or things that have been done for cars sold in markets that do have fuel efficiency standards. But we're not talking about, leaps and bounds, ahead of where we are in terms of efficiency. I think they showed a graph in the paper that compared the average fuel efficiency for new cars in the Australian market versus the US. And they weren't light years apart. It's less efficient here for sure, but we're not talking about the kind of gains that we need to be meeting our emissions objectives. The ultimate answer here is the introduction of more EVs, progressively over the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the interesting questions for us, introducing such a standard at this point of the technology cycle. So we're drawing a lot of our understanding of how a fuel efficiency standard worked from, many years of experience in other parts of the world. The US has had something like this going right back to the 70s. But in those cases, those nations were encouraging incremental technology improvements with the same fundamental technology. Whereas we're rapidly accelerating. We've got the foot on the accelerator towards a fundamental technology transition, which has already started. The move from the internal combustion engine to, what we expect will be a fleet of largely battery electric vehicles. So how does this sort of standard, introduced relatively late in the game, function in the context when you drop it in a market which, has hitherto not had any sort of standard and is already starting to accelerate towards a transition, right?
And there's a bit of uncertainty. Yeah. And other major markets are in the process of tightening their own standards to a very high degree over the next decade. And it's a bit of a leap into the unknown for everybody, where we probably do have to be slightly cautious about extrapolating from the way that these schemes functioned in the past to the way they will function in the future. And it looks plausible that there's going to be a great variety of battery electric vehicle models available for different sorts of user and context. But, you in this country, you can't reach out and touch a lot of those models yet. Literally, most of them aren't available here, which is part of the point of having a mandate that gives suppliers a good argument to head office as to why stock should be allocated to this market. But there's a decent amount of uncertainty.
I think that's probably ultimately behind the rationale for them choosing their Goldilocks option B versus option C. One of the biggest differences between them, and we should say, option A is not too much change to BAU. We're talking about a very slow start. What is it? A stonking 1 megaton in emissions savings out to 2050.
Cumulatively 1 megaton to 2050.
Basically bugger all. And I'm sure whoever was putting this report together had loads of fun on Excel drawing up those charts showing the big flat line for option A as the other two skyrocketed.
This is why I'm not sure if the Goldilocks analogy really holds, because I think option A is effectively in the freezer. One would have to put it out on the bench and let it defrost for several hours before it was edible.
It's a BAU option without calling it a BAU option, I reckon.
And the description of it in the paper is this weird balance of politeness and subtweeting.
It's very
because
polite.
It says, this doesn't represent the views of any one stakeholder. but is broadly similar to positions put by suppliers of vehicles. Not all of them.
No, with notable exceptions, apparently.
Yes.
One can make the assumption they've effectively said, okay, well, if we did what you wanted us to do, let's model that and see what happened. And what happens?
Yep.
Effectively nothing.
Now, to be sure, that the bit in that you could argue about the most is that their business as usual assumptions for what happens in the car market incorporate a significant level of take-up anyway of electric vehicles and a little bit of improvement of the baseline vehicle. So it's not like there's no emissions reductions versus today happening in that scenario.
Yep.
It's just that they don't think that the it's a standard that would have a similar rate of change to the US standards, but not attempt to converge with them. And the department reckons that doesn't do much more than what would happen anyway.
Correct. So then we're left really with two options if we're serious about this being, able to provide abatement from the transport sector and really get things moving. And option B sees our standards, take effect from 2025, really kicking in.
Sort of.
We'll get to that, I'm sure. Kick in the year after and then converge with the US's standards in 2028. But the option C sees us converge with the US around the 26 mark and then go beyond them. And I guess, the reason for wanting to bring that up then at this point is whether we think there would be, feasible gains in us going ahead of an enormous market like the US that obviously commands a lot more market influence than Australia does. I think that's where a lot of some of the uncertainty is here. It's not the only thing that distinguishes those options from each other, but going faster than the biggest markets that have influenced suppliers and presumably will continue to influence them probably does have some uncertainty attached to it. Are we going to get the mix of cars that we need in that time frame?
And I reckon you could argue that either way. I mean, on the be careful front, you're right, and there's arguments in the US from the auto industry there and the unions there to be careful about not going too fast. And as we record, just a couple of days ago, there was a piece in the New York Times suggesting that the Biden administration EPA is going to slow down its proposed standards to 2030 and speed them up after 2030. And I hear from people who watch these things that this is what they expected all along, and it's all fine. But the US picture is contested and uncertain and messy. But on the other hand, there's a little country called China. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they seem to be very excited about making everything and selling way more of it than they can possibly consume domestically. And I reckon we're going to have Chinese EVs of all sizes, all possible applications coming out of our ears if we want them. And others, others maybe too, but maybe we will get everything from China. People might not like that, but also they might because it'll be cheap.
Well, we do have a very particular lens into this as a nation without any domestic production of vehicles, right? So we are a taker of technology in this space for a bit over a decade now, I think. And it's interesting in kind of the storied history of this policy. There was kind of an assumption that it was being held back because of that domestic production and concerns about what the implications would be for that. And yet it sort of continued to fizzle out in various contexts, even after that domestic production had gone by the wayside. I wanted to ask a question which I don't know the answer to, which is, and I didn't see it unpacked in the paper, why they are pegging the vehicle standards to the US as opposed to Europe.
I had the same question.
Well, I wonder whether it's because, there's a view that the vehicle mix is more similar in the US, and so it's a better baseline for to work against. But Tennant, have you got any idea why they've chosen the US?
So I think that it is just the vibe of the US is a big country with lots of wide open spaces and an independent spirit of tough people who know what's what, and they don't drive boxy little socialist econo cars of the sort that actually makes for surprisingly good chase scenes in Bourne Identity. But I think it's really just that a lot of the vibe and the feeling that people have about the challenges of doing efficient cars in Australia seems on its face a bit weird when you look at the United States and say, oh, well, they've been doing this they passed their legislation 49 years ago this year. Although it's had ups and downs and, there's plenty of critics of that policy from the environmental point of view in the US as it's been implemented there. Still, they've been plugging away at it. So I think it's that. I don't think it's anything more scientific than relative perceived testosterone levels.
So, Tennant, I understand you locked yourself in your room over the weekend and fired up the spreadsheets and did some modelling. What were you trying to determine? What was the question that was exercising your mind that you felt the need to turn to Excel for answers because it wasn't being answered by this paper?
What is the matrix?
Yeah, what is the matrix? Red pill or blue pill?
Oh, it's become a very different question in the 25 years since The Matrix came out. That's a depressing stat. So I wanted to have a look at what is the gap between the standards that are proposed in option B and the most popular cars being sold in the market today, because I had heard some worries on the socials from people concerned that the old versions of the US and EU standards had effectively encouraged vehicle bloat. There was lighter treatment of heavier vehicles, and this produced the SUV explosion. And the same thing they feared was going to happen with this standard. And I had a look at it, and I'm still refining my figures, but my dodgy spreadsheet says that the most popular vehicles being sold in Australia today would all be dramatically above almost all of them would be dramatically above the 2028 standard. Even the hybrids would be a little above the standard.
When you say above the standard, you mean they'd be more carbon intensive?
Yes.
Than the standard.
They would have a honking big pile of debits for every Ford Ranger sold, or the Raptor, or look, I'm a terrible judge of these vehicles and how people feel about them. I upgraded from a 2007 Toyota Yaris last year to a 2015 Toyota Yaris previously driven by my mother-in-law. So I'm not a car guy, is what I'm saying. But for every one of those Raptors and Rangers and Cyclopses and whatever else there is out there, I made that last one up, I think, those suppliers would need to be selling like a fully electric equivalent to come out in the wash. Even selling more hybrids would only help them so much. So I just don't think there's a lot of room in that standard for the kinds of clever gaming that people believe happened in the US and the EU by shifting car buyers from, somebody walks into a dealership wanting a two-seat smart car and walks out with a tank. There's not a lot of room to try and do that sort of thing and actually come out ahead on the standard.
No.
In fact, there's no room. You would lose big time.
This is really just about how quickly every supplier can introduce a decent amount of EVs into their fleet over the next little while.
Or buy some credits off someone else who has.
Right. So I think one of the questions I came away with when looking at the options out of this is, just to have a little think about what that that response is going to be like from suppliers, where you've got to consider the mix of vehicles in their current fleet. Like if you're a supplier in the Australian market and only bringing in pretty big gas guzzling utes, you'll be a bit worried if you don't have plans to be introducing an EV option. But if you are progressing all those, then you'll be able, presumably they'll be able to manage across the fleet.
And they did talk about the option of, I don't know what the terminology was they urged, but effectively pooling, right. So if you're, largely bringing utes and then there's another company that's largely bringing EVs, you do have the option of pooling your supply together.
In scenario A.
Yeah, not in B or C. No.
Okay.
No pool for you, Luke.
No.
Well, which leaves you with the trading credits later, which, the government's not particularly interested in what arrangements you come to. So one imagines you could effectively, if you were able to secure that agreement, come to a similar sort of arrangement.
Yeah.
It was like, basically an agreement to buy the credits that would allow you to continue selling those vehicles in Australia.
Yeah, and what price are the credits going to cost? Well, I guess that's just down to supply and demand, with the ceiling of the penalty level in option B for failing to meet the standard and failing to acquire sufficient credits is set at 100 Australian dollars per gram kilometre of failure, which is it's a bit of money.
Well, it's not as high as the EU has or the equivalent. It's nothing to sneeze at. I mean, it's sort of at the level that would probably compel compliance.
My dodgy spreadsheet says that in 2028, the value difference, the maximum value difference to the supplier, if they were unable to acquire any credits for something less or do anything themselves, the value difference to them of selling a diesel Ford Ranger versus selling a zero emissions electric Ford Ranger, if such a thing exists by 2028, is $24,000. That they could save themselves $24,000 by selling the electric one, or a maximum of $24,000, which I don't know, again, not a car guy, but that sounds like a motive to rustle up some electric ones.
So there's a lot of detail here, and one of the questions that you can almost hear the public servants fretting about through the pages is, how on earth they're going to get this up by 2025, right?
Yep.
I mean, they're pretty explicit in the paper about some of the challenges that they.
Do you think this might be like a cry for help?
I think it's
to the Transport Minister and the Climate and Energy Minister going, seriously,
like,
guys.
How do we launch a tender for an IT project without launching an IT tender for a project in the consultation phase to save us some time?
The documents were handed over with little tear stains to the ministers.
They're shining the bat signal, but it's for a hackathon, not a superhero.
No. So, I mean, have basically said they would be seeking to introduce legislation this year for it to take effect, or, for all the processes to be up and running early next year. Part of that infrastructure would involve the Department of Infrastructure being the regulator, or a team within it. But then they also need to build up, I guess, mostly IT infrastructure that then integrates with, existing requirements in the auto space. You've got a registry that, every car brought into the market needs to be entered into. They need to comply with a bunch of other things. So this would need to talk to that. You need to establish a registry for credits and debits for suppliers to be got onto, and anyone who's had any insight into how quickly or not government can get those kind of IT projects up and running would be sweating up a storm at the at the thought of needing to do that in less than 6 months.
Yeah. This is a topic close to my heart because I've said a word or two from time to time about CBAMs. I think the biggest barrier to the introduction of a CBAM in Australia is not the WTO or arguments about impacts on prices. It's getting Home Affairs computer systems and the clean energy regulators computer systems to talk to each other sometime this century. So good luck, Department of Infrastructure, Transport, etc. We'll be pulling for you, if not programming for you.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing, in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. But before we get to our traditional item that is captivating us, we have one that is captivating our collective attention, which is the very recent launch of our Patreon. Tennant, for anyone that has missed the short, sharp bonus episode we released earlier this week, what's going on with the Patreon? What's that all about?
Well, if you're this far into this episode, you probably are a glutton for punishment. And if that's true, you'll want even more bonus content that you can listen to, featuring us talking about even more reports that we don't have time to get to in the regular podcast. And that's the core product, the core bonus content of this Patreon that if you back, you will get. But that's not all.
It's not all. What else is there, Frankie?
You will get access to the notes that we write up for our episodes. So the concise notes that we're all reading and looking at while we chat for the pod. And, other fun stuff like, voting on that we should read, or having a look at the episode title that didn't quite make it. Lots of fun little things like that. And we want to hear more from you as well.
Yeah. And, this sounds amazing. What is the low price that summer operas can access all this BOCO for?
For as little as $10 a month. All this could be yours, along with the knowledge that you are helping to make this here podcast sustainable, in the sense of us being able to continue doing it, and in fact Luke being able to survive the editing process.
By ideally not doing it.
Yes. To witness the editing process.
Yes. From a comfortable lounge elsewhere. So, if you're up for supporting us to do this podcast, if you love what we do and want us to continue doing it, I encourage you to make your way to patreon.com/letmesumup, where details abound and the opportunity to support your favourite podcasters to do a thing that they love is available. All right. With that brief ad break out of the way, back to regularly scheduled programming. We're doing one more thing. Frankie, what have you got?
Well, I just can't get my mind off of methane these days. And I thought, well...
Okay.
Yeah, I know, coming from someone with 2 small children, I could easily be talking about something else. But in fact, I am talking about the US's pretty bold moves. Late last year, out of COP28 in Dubai, they announced some new rules the EPA would be adopting as part of their broader methane emissions reduction program. And just recently, they've announced that they'll be introducing a waste emissions charge for methane that would apply to oil and gas facilities that emit, above a certain determined threshold. So all I really wanted to point out is that we've got this country, the US, was very crucial in getting the global methane pledge at COP26 in Glasgow, and they have actually done quite a few things in terms of policy responses to that. The rule changes last year will require much more, stringent and continuous monitoring for methane leaks at facilities, and encourage them to use, the latest technology to monitor for that. Aerial surveys, drones, all this kind of stuff. And they're also now starting to back that in, with penalties if those things aren't done. So I just think that's an interesting development. And it also, I think, provides a good roadmap for other countries that have signed on to this pledge but haven't, potentially made more concrete moves, to start bringing down those emissions. So, yeah.
Australia.
That's it. Well, yes. But every other country that signed up to the pledge, like, I think, just a high five to the US and the EPA for taking it on. It's good to see them moving along that direction.
All right. What about you, Tennant? What have you got?
Well, you were talking about things that are close to our hearts, and I love a good chart. So I'm going to mention the annual update to the Climate and Energy mega presentation Ultra Chart Super Feast that is put up by a guy named Nat Bullard, who was the once the chief charts guy for Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and now is an independent chart slinger. And if you can imagine it, he has a chart of it in terms of what is going on with climate and energy, what's the depressing news around temperature extremes and falls in sea ice, what's the exciting news around the pace of deployment of various key clean techs around the world, and the I don't know how this is going to work out news about shifts in the trade environment and the emergence of China, as referenced earlier, as the biggest exporter of cars in the world, biggest exporter of EVs in the world. There's a lot of stuff in there. We'll have a link in the show notes, but if you like charts, there's 200 slides here to satisfy your cravings.
I reckon there might be one or two listeners that are into charts, Tennant. For my one more thing, I'm going to revisit the opening topic, the superpower address from Ross and Rod. I didn't just read the paper, I watched the Q&A, and it was really interesting. And lots of questions from the journos were like trying to pick at the scab of the climate wars and going, well, this is all very well. You pointy-headed economists, how are we ever going to build the consensus in this country for doing something this big and this hard? And Ross Garnaut harked back to some of the big economic reforms of the 80s, which of course he supported and participated in, and in particular the long-term public advocacy that was undertaken by the Hawke government to do really unimaginable, impossible things like removing long-standing tariff barriers to trade. And he said that in 1983, when the Hawke government was elected, the eye-watering investments that are being contemplated in their superpower plan. Tariff reform was regarded as politically impossible. It had sort of blown up the Whitlam government. So there was like really recent political history of this being tried, but it not working and being incredibly unpopular. But he said, look, Prime Minister Hawke said, well, this is the right direction. We're not going to introduce it straight away, but we're going to start engaging in the public advocacy that will be necessary for us to build the consensus that will allow us to make these reforms. And as we know how that story ended. Ultimately, the Hawke and Keating governments won the day after a number of years of telling that story to the Australian public. So his point was that we need to move beyond the reflexive chucking of things into the too hard basket, and he was, really elevating the role of our political leaders in building consensus over big changes and acknowledging that takes time. It was an inspiring thought. And I guess the question that leaves one with is, does the 80s era theory of change hold in the 2020s? I don't know. I guess Garno is challenging Australia's current leaders to find out.
Yeah. They did some big stuff. They absolutely did. Some of those things some people now feel were failures and have undermined the case for future reform. A lot of people don't feel that way. A lot of people feel like actually the opening up of the economy was pretty good. I don't know. Case unproven. The future is not written. No fate for what we make.
As Doc Brown says in Back to the Future 3, your future isn't written yet. Nobody's is. Your future is whatever you make it. So make it a good one.
Oh, I love that.
It's great when we can build consensus between Doc Brown and Sarah Connor.
All right. That is our show for today. If you have comments, questions or reports you'd like us to cover on an upcoming episode, you can send them through to mailbag@letmesumup.net. Tennant, we have a website. What is it?
It's www.letmesumup.net, and there's all the episodes at it except the bonus ones. But you know where to find those, dear listener.
Well, do they? Have they already forgotten? Tennant, let's ask Frankie, where do they find the bonus episodes? And indeed, maybe you could tell the listeners, Frankie, about the bonus episode that is up there right now.
Well, if you mosey on over to patreon.com/letmesumup and whip out your wallets, you, dear summer uppers, can listen to us wax lyrical about one of the hottest policy discussions that was in 2023. We didn't quite get to the new, improved and reamped Victorian gas substitution roadmap 2.0 on the regular pod last year, but we just couldn't let that go without comment. So we've had a yarn about that, and you can hear all about what we thought if you sign up to the Patreon. So please do.
And it couldn't be more relevant. There's so much more yet to come on the substitution front, my God.
Patreon.com/letmesumup. Get on that new hotness. But in the meantime, for Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you again soon. All right. Can we call it there?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
We can do some Boko if you want. If you really feel the need to do another half hour.
Not that I wanted.
I'm probably going to go.
Consumer welfare loss is ideal Boko fodder.
I know.
This is a great idea. You two could catch up and generate post-show Boko, which we just post with unedited.
Luke, can you train a bot to use your voice to go, yes.
Oh, how fascinating. Tell me more. And then we will just keep telling you more. It's like you could come back in a fortnight's time and we'll still be going through it.
We'll have almost got to the bottom of it.